Good evening. I will talk in English so Peter Gray could listen well. So before I introduce our special guest, I would like to say a few words about why are we here. It was winter, beginning of 2012. I was in London, just lost a job and had a lot of free time. One day I was surfing the web as usual when I came across a 4-part series of articles called Children Educate Themselves. It sounded interesting, so I saved it for later, and when I finally get to reading it, I was blown away. I read it in one breath. It was something I already knew about but couldn't put into words. It was something that was missing in my view on children and their learning. In these articles, there were words like this, quote, "Children's education is children's responsibility, not ours. Only they can do it. They are built to do it. Our task regarding education is just to stand back and let it happen. The more we try to control it, the more we interfere." End quote. And other brilliant ideas. I was hooked, and in following days, I read the whole blog where these articles appeared, containing more than 50 of them. The blog was called Freedom to Learn. I took 15 of these articles, translated them in Czech, and put them on a new website called After That Blog, svobodaučení.cz. And the rest is history, as Michal was talking about in the beginning. And after 4 years, we are honored to have Dr. Peter Gray, the author of that blog, here in Prague, and to have an opportunity to talk with him finally in person. Peter Gray is a research professor at Boston College, is author of a book, Free to Learn, and psychology textbook. He has conducted and published research in comparative evolutionary developmental and educational psychology. He did his undergraduate study at Columbia University and earned a PhD in biological sciences at Rockefeller University. His current research and writing focus primarily on children's natural ways of learning and lifelong value of play. So now let me introduce to you Dr. Peter Gray.
Thank you so much. What a great honor it is to be here. What a great honor it is that you all have come. So I'm an evolutionary psychologist, which means that I am interested in human nature. I'm interested in how that nature came about by natural selection. And I'm particularly interested in the nature of human children, and most particularly in those aspects of children's nature that came about by natural selection to serve the function of their education. And basically, that's pretty much all of children's nature. When we think about children, what do we think about? We think about their curiosity. Children are curious. We're all curious, but children are especially curious. We think about their playfulness. We're all playful, but children are especially playful. We think about their sociability. We're all social. We're the social animal, but children are especially social. They really pay attention to other people. That's the thing they're most curious about, is other people, and what are other people doing, and what are other people talking about. And we can't help as parents to think about their willfulness. They want to do what they want to do, not necessarily what we want them to do. This is the nature of children everywhere in the world. This is how children come into the world. And my argument basically is this, that these aspects of children's nature came about over the course of evolution precisely to serve the function of their education. We are the educatable animal. We are the animal that has always depended upon education. Education is not new. Schools are new, but education is not new. Education has been with us for at least as long as we have been human beings. We have always been the animal that survives by the transmission of culture from one generation to the next. And it has always, throughout this period, been the responsibility of children to acquire that culture, not the responsibility of adults to make sure it's handed down. That wouldn't work very well. Adults are too inconsistent in what they do. It can't be the responsibility of parents. Throughout history, very frequently, your parents would be dead before you would have grown up. It has to be your responsibility. In the course of natural selection, any children who were born without a strong drive to figure out what the culture is about and what they have to learn to be successful adults in that culture, any child born with lacking those tendencies would not survive, or if survived, would not attract a mate. The genes would be lost. So natural selection has been a powerful, powerful force for those aspects of children's nature that serve the function of their education. Now, my talk, if the front of this handout gives an outline of my talk, and it's worth probably following along to see the argument as I go through, and once in a while I refer to it. The back page is there just so you'll know that I'm a university professor. My excuse for having it there, my other excuse for having it there, is that I'm always frustrated myself when somebody gives a talk and they give out what sounds like scientific information, and then they don't tell me where I can find this. And if I hear something that sounds contrary to what my initial beliefs are, I'm especially frustrated. So I always find it useful to present the sources that I'm talking from, where you can look up the original studies, you can examine the ideas in a more full way than I can possibly present in this short presentation. So the title of my talk is The Biology of Education, How Children Learn Through Free Play and Exploration. And my thesis in this talk is that play is children's natural means of educating themselves. Play evolved in mammals and especially in human beings to serve the function of education. The first person to develop this theory was the German philosopher and naturalist Karl Groos. Groos was active in writing not too long after Darwin's Origin of Species. He was one of the few scholars who really understood Darwin, and in fact, in some ways, he understood Darwin better than Darwin did. He was sort of advanced from Darwin in terms of his interpretations. He had a more modern view of evolution than Darwin did. And he thought about, and he immediately began to think about questions of animal and human behavior from a Darwinian evolutionary point of view. And he was quite well versed in what was called naturalism at that time, studies of animal behavior. He himself had made observations, and he was well aware of other researchers' observations. And one thing that was puzzling him from an evolutionary point of view is, why do young animals play? You know, I mean, from a Darwinian perspective, at least when you first think of it, this is wasted effort. It takes calories. It makes noise. It attracts predators. Some of the play they engage in is dangerous. Sometimes an animal kills itself, dies in play. Why wouldn't natural selection have weeded out this apparently maladaptive behavior? Well, he reasoned, as any good Darwinian would, that if this is maladaptive in some way, if there's some costs to play, that must be outweighed by some advantage. And what could that advantage be? So he developed the theory, based on the ways that animals play, that the advantage of play, the reason the young of essentially all mammals play, is because mammals, unlike fishes and unlike reptiles, and even to some degree unlike birds, have to learn a lot. They don't have fixed instincts. Their behavior depends a lot upon learning, and even their instincts, they have to practice their instinctive behaviors so that they become good at them. So he developed what is still today called the practice theory of play. which is that the evolutionary purpose of play, or at least one of the major evolutionary purposes of play among mammals, is that it is how young mammals practice the skills that they need to develop to survive and thrive and ultimately reproduce and be successful from a Darwinian perspective. So in 1898, he published a book called The Play of Animals, in which he presented this practice theory. Among animal behaviorists, this theory of play is still very well accepted. There are many people who work on play and from the viewpoint of animal behavior, and in many cases, this theory is almost the baseline from which they begin their own work and their theorizing. The theory explains a number of important facts about play. First of all, it explains the obvious fact that the young play more than older ones of the species. Why? Because they've got more to learn. Among most mammals, it's only the young that play. Adults don't really play at all. There's some mammals where adults play some. And of course, in our domesticated cats and dogs, they play because in the process of domestication, we've created a brain that is sort of always a young brain in those animals. But most animals don't play as adults. They play as youngsters, and their play then is serving, according to Groos's theory, the function of their learning the skills that they need to learn for successful adulthood. A second thing it explains is the differences among different animal species in the amount that they play. As Groos pointed out, and as many researchers have confirmed, those animals that have the most to learn, those species that have the most to learn, that depend least upon rigid instinct and most upon learning, play the most. So primates play more than non-primates, apes play more than monkeys, human beings, when free to do so, play more than any other animal on Earth. Carnivores play more than herbivores, and Groos argued this is because it's harder to learn how to hunt than it is to learn how to graze. So you can predict how much an animal will play to a considerable degree by knowing how much it has to learn. And a third thing it explains is the ways in which different species of animals play. And Groos argued you can kind of predict what an animal will play at by knowing what its constraints are for successful survival and reproduction. So, for example, carnivores play at predation. They play at pouncing on game or chasing game. So when you watch your dog, who is kind of a derivative of a wolf, when it's chasing a car, it's chasing big game. When it's chasing a tennis ball, it's chasing small game. So carnivores play at chasing, and cat-like animals play at creeping up and pouncing. These are hard skills to learn, and they play at them. Predatory animals don't play at chasing and pouncing, they play at running away. They play at fleeing and dodging. The universal animal game is tag. All animals play tag. But the animals that are basically prey animals, their favorite position in tag is to be the one who's running away. So one animal will come up and nudge another one and then run away gleefully, hoping that the other one is chasing him to get away. Predatory animals play, their favorite position in tag is to be the one doing the chasing. And there's ways that animal behaviorists have verified this. So Groos's practice theory makes a lot of sense in terms of animal behavior, and it's interesting that in general, people who study animal behavior accept it. Well, after writing The Play of Animals, Groos wrote another book called The Play of Man. And whereas The Play of Animals is quite well known among animal behaviorists, The Play of Man is hardly known at all among anybody, and certainly not well known among psychologists. I've spoken at many psychology conferences, and people have never heard of this book, The Play of Man. In fact, when I first became aware of the book some years ago, I had great difficulty getting it. It was out of print, and I managed to get Amazon to find a used copy of it. Now it's back in print again, as I understand it. But this is a book that has been rather neglected, and it really, I think, is Groos called it a theory of play, a theory of human play. I think it's a theory of education. I don't think Groos was quite ready to go so far as to say it was a theory of education and not just a theory of play. But basically, in the play of man, Groos said, well, of course, the human being is an animal like other mammals, and the human being has so much to learn, and that's why human beings, when they're free to do so, play as youngsters much more even than other apes do. And moreover, he said, there's another difference between human beings and other mammals. And that is culture. Human beings have to learn not just those skills that are important to human beings everywhere on Earth, like two-legged walking and talking and those things that people do everywhere, but human beings also have to learn those particular skills that are unique to the culture in which they are growing up. So he proposed in the play of man that young humans come into the world not only with this powerful drive to play, but they also come into the world with a powerful drive to look around, see what people are doing, see what it is that's important to learn in your culture, and to incorporate that into your play so that you will become skilled at it. That was basically his theory. He called it a theory of play, but isn't that a theory of education? If education is defined as acquisition of the culture, then play, by according to Groos's theory, is how children acquire the culture. They acquire it by observing and then by playing at the things that they see are valuable. Well, I became interested in this theory, and as one way of testing the theory, I became interested in play among hunter-gatherer cultures. Now, as most of you know, we were all hunter-gatherers until a mere 10 or 11,000 years ago. You know, from the viewpoint of written history, 10 or 11,000 years ago is a long time, but from the viewpoint of evolution, it's just an eye blink. So we evolved ourselves, we evolved our brains, we evolved our instincts, our way of being in the context of being hunter-gatherers. Now it's interesting that some groups of people managed to survive as hunter-gatherers into the 20th century. There's still some remnants of hunter-gatherer cultures even today. But in the middle, from sort of the middle part of the 20th century on to about the 1980s or so, it was still possible for anthropologists to go out into various parts of Africa and Asia, South America, Australia, New Zealand, and find people who were living pretty much a pristine hunter-gatherer way of life. They had been isolated enough from modern cultures that they seemed to be living pretty much the way they had always lived. And there have been, all in all, 2 or 3 dozen such cultures that have been pretty well studied by anthropologists, some of them very fully studied by anthropologists. So I began by reading what anthropologists had to say about children in such cultures and the relationship between adults and children. And I was particularly interested in what skills people had to learn in those cultures and how they learned them. But I discovered that the anthropologists didn't write a lot about that. They wrote some, but they didn't write a whole lot. So I decided to do a little survey. A graduate student at that time of mine and I concocted a little survey that we sent out. We identified 10 different anthropologists, reasonably well-known anthropologists, who among them had lived in 7 different hunter-gatherer cultures on 3 different continents. We wanted to get a diversity of hunter-gatherer cultures. And we asked them in this survey questions about children's lives, questions about what children needed to learn, about how they learned it, and questions about play, questions about parents' attitudes towards children, and so on. So what I learned, even though these represented 7 different cultures on 3 different continents, in climates ranging from deserts to jungles, What I got back in response to those surveys was very, very similar for every single culture. First of all, there are certain similarities among these cultures anyway, enough that some anthropologists feel it's quite reasonable to talk about hunter-gatherer culture in the singular. That doesn't mean that there aren't some real differences, different languages, different religious rituals, different ways of hunting, different ways of gathering. But in terms of the basic social organization and the basic human values that are represented, hunter-gatherer cultures are remarkably similar. And another name for these banned hunter-gatherer cultures that anthropologists regularly use in their writings is egalitarian cultures. These are by far the most egalitarian peoples that have ever been found on Earth, people living in these hunter-gatherer cultures. We mustn't mix up these cultures with so-called tribal cultures, which can be fierce, where you have chiefs or big men, and you have a kind of hierarchical structure, and you can have violence and so on and so forth. Those are really not hunter-gatherer cultures. Those are post-agricultural cultures, which may involve some hunting and gathering. But hunter-gatherers, banned hunter-gatherers, to be clear, do not have big men, they do not have chiefs, they do not have a hierarchical structure within their culture. They're not totally, I can't say that violence is totally absent from them. They're human beings. They get enraged sometimes and violence does occur. But unlike many of the agricultural cultures that follow them, they never condone violence. They never accept violence as a normal thing. They would never praise somebody for killing somebody because that person molested their wife or whatever it is. They would never condone violence. They would never condone the back and forth violence that becomes part of tribal life in many other cultures post-hunter-gatherer. They live in small bands of maybe 20 to 50 people per band, counting children, and they're mobile. They move around from place to place, from sort of campsite to follow the available game and vegetation. And because they're mobile, because they don't have permanent homes, they don't accumulate property. Property would be a burden if you owned more than what you could carry with you. And that certainly feeds into their being egalitarian. There's no sense in owning any more than anything else. They survive because they are so skilled at cooperation and sharing. Their entire lifestyle depends upon cooperation. They hunt cooperatively. If one person is successful in killing a large game, they have to share it with others, and that's the assurance against the fact that they may not get any game for a long time after that. Your insurance against death really depends upon your cooperation with others in the band, and they even cooperate across bands if one band is more needy than another. So as part of their strong egalitarian culture, they have also an extraordinary degree of respect for individual autonomy. They are so much opposed to the idea of hierarchy, to the idea that anybody is somebody else's boss, that according to the anthropologists I talked to and according to the writing of the anthropologists, they do not tell one another what to do. They take pains not to tell one another what to do. They think it would be wrong, it would be arrogant. If I believe that I'm a better hunter than you are and I tell you how you should hunt, I would be regarded as being arrogant. Maybe you would ask me for some advice, and then maybe I would in some humble way give you some thoughts about it from my perspective. But if I were to impose my thoughts about it upon you, that would be acting like a big shot. People would start to make fun of me for doing that. They would say, "Oh, you think you're such a big shot, that you think you're a better hunter than everybody else." Now, what's really remarkable, and almost I couldn't believe it at first. I thought I was hearing from people who were presenting me with biased points of view. But when I heard it from all of these anthropologists, and I read it wherever I read it, the remarkable thing is they apply this to children. They don't tell children what to do. They don't tell children what to do. So that's the first point about this. If these cultures that survived as modern hunter-gatherer cultures in various parts of the world, if these represent in this kind of way, the way human beings existed throughout time until agriculture, this means that throughout most of human history, children were growing up without adults telling them what to do. And that's something that's hard for us in our culture today to get our heads around. So one of my conclusions, the first and maybe most important conclusion from this looking into hunter-gatherer cultures, is that children in these cultures are trusted. They're trusted in a way that's hard for us to imagine. Their instincts are trusted. Their logic is trusted. Their willfulness is trusted. Parents don't see parenting as a battle of will, where they have to somehow overcome the will of the child. The child's will is what reigns in terms of the child's behavior. Let me just read a few quotations that give you kind of a flavor of the way different anthropologists talked about this. So here's one. This happens to be an anthropologist named Yumi Goso, who's writing an article about hunter-gatherer cultures in general, but she herself studies a group in South America called the Paracana. So she wrote, hunter-gatherers do not give orders to their children. For example, no adult announces bedtime at night. Children remain around adults until they feel tired and fall asleep. Adults do not interfere with their children's lives. They never beat, scold, or behave aggressively with them, physically or verbally, nor do they offer praise or keep track of their development. Let me read that last part again. Nor do they offer praise or keep track of their development. They just trust that things are going to come out okay. You know, this business of not hitting a child, one other anthropologist told me that in the group that he studied, there were three really important prohibitions, the worst things that a person can do. One is murder, one is incest, and another is hitting a child. These are the things, these are the taboos, he says, in the culture that he was studying. Here's another quotation. The idea that this is my child or your child does not exist. Deciding what another person should do, no matter what his age, is outside the Equana vocabulary of behavior. This happens to be another South American group. There's great interest in what everyone does, but no impulse to influence, let alone coerce anyone. The child's will is his motive force. This is the kind of thing that I heard really about all of these cultures. And here's one more. This one happens to be somebody who studied a group of Inuit in the Hudson Bay area. Infants and young children are allowed to explore their environments to the limits of their physical capacities and with minimal interference from adults. Thus, if a child picks up a hazardous object, parents generally leave it to explore the dangers on its own. The child is presumed to know what it is doing. So I have a friend, actually a colleague at Boston College, Gilda Morelli is her name, who in the 1980s and to some degree 90s lived among a group of hunter-gatherers in Central Africa called the Efe. And she was actually the person who initially got me interested in hunter-gatherers and got me to think that it would be fascinating to learn more about them. But she showed me slides that she had of little toddlers, 2-year-olds playing with machetes, playing with fire, adults sitting back, not paying any attention to this. And I asked her, do the children sometimes hurt themselves? And she said, yes. They sometimes cut themselves. They sometimes burn themselves. Most people have some scars from when they were children playing in this kind of way, but they don't kill themselves. They don't mortally injure themselves in this way. And I said, well, why do the parents let them do it? And she said, well, what they would say is, how else are they going to learn? How else are they going to learn if they don't play? It's very important that children in hunter-gatherer culture learn how to use these things. Fire, these are the main tools of the culture. And the earlier they start to use them, the more these are going to be kind of natural extensions of their body. That machete, those knives and those digging sticks and the bows and arrows, the fire that they're playing with, these are these almost have to be extensions of their body. Well, if they start playing with the two, nobody's telling the 2-year-olds to do it. They're just doing it, right? But they're not stopping the 2-year-olds. And the reason they're not stopping the 2-year-olds is because they believe this is what 2-year-olds do. They're doing it for a good reason. And that reason maybe is that they will then become much better at using these tools because they started while they were still very, very young using them. Second conclusion that came from my looking into hunter-gatherer cultures was this, that children learn the skills of the culture through their self-directed play and exploration. So one of the questions that we asked in this survey was, what are the things, so that they told us, well, first of all, let me say, one of their questions was, how much time do children have for play? Now, given what I've already said, that adults don't give orders to children, the answer would almost have to be all the time. And indeed, that's how every single one of these anthropologists answered it, essentially all the time. So here's a couple of quotations just to illustrate the way they answered the question. So one anthropologist said, both boys and girls had almost all day, every day, free to play. Another said, children were free to play nearly all the time. No one expected children to do any serious work until they were in their late teens. And then they went on to elaborate that this is partly because they don't believe in telling children what to do. And so, of course, what children do is they play. And in addition to that, what they said is that, and what the anthropologists elaborated on in some cases, is the skills that children need to learn, to really do, that are really important to adult life in hunter-gatherer cultures, require a lot of skill and a lot of knowledge. And children can't really contribute all that much anyway. That's different from farming. There's a lot of just plain rote labor in farming, and you can have kids doing it. But kids need a lot of skill before they can really be effective hunters, and even before they can really be effective gatherers. Some of them go along willingly, and they want to take part in these things. That's part of what kids want to do. And they do play a role in hunting together, but they're never asked to, and they always do it playfully. They always do it just in their own way. The kids are generally not allowed to go on the hunting trips until they're kind of teenagers because they would interfere with the hunting. That's one case where the adults would say, no, you can't come with us, but they would be sure to find some other thing that the kids could do. And so another question we asked was, what are the forms of play? So they're playing all the time. They're playing all the time. You know, the other thing I can elaborate on this is the age range we're talking about is, interestingly, age 4 to late teenage years. Interesting that those are the same ages that Sudbury model schools accept children at, right? And they don't regard you as a child if you're under age 4. Not that they have an automatic cutoff. I'm not sure that they even know the precise ages of their children. But that it's generally about age 4 that hunter-gatherers believe that children have wisdom, that children have enough knowledge. And what a psychologist would say probably is that they've incorporated language sufficiently that they're able to keep rules in mind, they're able to control, they're able to think about what they're doing. They don't need an external voice telling them all the time what they're doing. They've incorporated some of this into their own minds, so they're not going to go wildly running off into the jungle and get eaten by tigers. They're not going to do really dangerous things because they're 4 years old. They've reached the age of wisdom when they can control themselves, when they know what's safe and what's not safe. They know enough, if they're going to go off into the jungle, to hang with some of the older kids who can watch out for them in case they do run into a tiger or something dangerous. And they play until sometimes people say that the concept that teenagers are still children is a modern concept, but that apparently is not true. Hunter-gatherers regard you as a child pretty much until you have your own child. And you don't generally have your own child until you are at least in your late teens, and maybe not until older. There's something about the hunter-gatherer way of life. You're lean, you don't have a lot of body fat, you're very active, that actually prevents ovulation from occurring until you're about 18 or 19 years old or older. So that you don't have young teenagers having kids, and you are pretty much regarded as a kid. You're playing with the kids until you reach that stage where you do have kids. So we asked them then, what are they playing at? And what we found is exactly the kind of finding that Karl Groos would have predicted. They're playing very much at the activities that they observe among the adults around them in their culture. So this very specific things that they were playing at depended to a considerable degree on which hunter-gatherer culture it was. But let me read just a partial list of some of the things that were mentioned, at least by one and often by more than one of these anthropologists in response to questions of what they were playing at. Digging up tubers, fishing, smoking porcupines out of holes, cooking, caring for infants, climbing trees, building vine ladders, building huts, using knives and other tools, making tools, carrying heavy loads, building rafts, making fires, defending against attacks from pretend predators, imitating animals, which of course would be a way of learning how to identify animals, making music, dancing, storytelling. These cultures all have sort of rich musical and in some cases other kinds of artistic tradition, and certainly they have dances, and the children are playing at the traditional dances and ways of making music as well as inventing their own. And arguing were all mentioned by one or more respondents. Quite a few of them said that they observed a lot of pretend arguing. Well, these are cultures where the adults make decisions by consensus. And so if you're going to have sway as an adult, you better be effective as a person who knows how to present your point of view without antagonizing others. One anthropologist, this was not from my survey, but this was anthropologist from a book. This is an anthropologist, Colin Turnbull, who studied the Mbuti. And he wrote that in the culture that he was studying, the children would build a sort of play village that wherever the campsite was and the adults had built the huts that they were going to live in temporarily, which was the real village for the time being, the children far enough away that it was out of sight and out of earshot would build a play village that was modeled after the adult village. So what are they doing? First of all, they're practicing building huts. They're practicing creating a village, something that they know they'll be doing. But then, according to Turnbull, Turnbull would go and observe them kind of indiscreetly. And what he would observe is quite often they would act out what they had seen among the adults around the campfire the night before. And so if there had been an argument about something, and one of the adults was particularly obtuse and particularly stupid in his argument, they would lampoon that adult. They would exaggerate how stupid his argument was, how bad it was, until they were all just laughing and rolling on the floor with laughter at this stupid adult. He said that sometimes also in this game, they would try to improve upon the arguments. They would start off by kind of mimicking the arguments they would heard, and then somebody would present a better argument, a more well-stated argument. Isn't that interesting? Nobody's telling them to do this. No adults are telling them to do this. But somehow they're growing up in a culture in which they realize that one of the skills I have to learn is how to argue effectively. If I'm going to be an effective adult in this culture and have influence in a culture where there's no king, nobody making the decisions, but we have to make the decisions and we have to be responsible and help get our points across without antagonizing other people. That they're actually deliberately practicing that in a very playful way. The other thing from that message is, and this is something that I've heard also from Danny Greenberg, the founder of Sudbury Valley, who you just referred to, is that we don't have to be as afraid as we think we have to be afraid of protecting our children from bad examples, because they can recognize bad examples. And they learn from them too, just as they're learning, okay, this seems to work. This is an adult who's admired. This is some behavior that seems to be healthy and so on. They can see another behavior. This doesn't seem to work. This is something for us to avoid. This is something we're going to make fun of this amongst ourselves, and we're going to impress upon ourselves that this is not the way for us to behave. So all of the respondents said that the boys in the culture that they observed played endlessly at tracking and hunting. So in a culture that hunts with bows and arrows, they were tracking and they were hunting at bows. They were shoot with the bows and arrows. Little toddlers would be shooting at butterflies and toads and so on and so forth. At some point, they would actually sometimes be killing small game, and in a very playful way, they would march back to camp with it and cook it up and so on. They were, in a sense, providing some food, but not because this was work, not because anybody was telling them that they were responsible for doing that, but just because that was part of their play. Play gradually evolves into real hunting, still done in a playful-like way by the adults, by the adult men. Tracking is an enormously difficult skill. There's a whole book written by a South African anthropologist. I forget the title of it, but the thesis of the book is that tracking is the origin of science in human beings, that tracking involves the same kinds of skills. You are using the little mark in the sand, the little bent twig, the fact that there's a centipede trail that goes over the mark in the sand, and you know that centipede only goes at a certain time of day, and you're bringing all of this together, and you are deducing from that what kind of animal it was, what time of day it went by, how fast it was moving, whether or not it's going to be worth trying to catch up to this animal or not. And while they're doing this, there's enormous discussion among the men about it, and there's comparison, there's every aspect of what we today call science is involved in this. There's the empirical evidence, but you're trying to make sense of that empirical evidence by developing hypotheses, and then you're continuously testing those hypotheses. So the point I'm trying to make is that let's not believe that because hunter-gatherer cultures are so-called primitive cultures that they don't have to learn some really complicated and difficult things, but they learn them on their own. The kids are practicing tracking all the time. They track one another, they track the adults, they track animals that have gone through camp. There's no such thing as privacy in a hunter-gatherer camp because everybody can track you by following your footprints. So those are the ways that the children play. The one culture that we included in our study was the Agta happens to be a culture where women as well as men hunt. And this is a culture, not surprisingly, in which little girls as well as boys play at hunting. So apparently what you do, if you're growing up in hunter-gatherer culture, you look around, you see what the adults do. If there's gender specificity to what they do, then you pay attention to what gender they are. And if it's your gender, you do those things, you practice those things, you incorporate them into play. All right, so the conclusion from this is about hunter-gatherer cultures. Well, hunter-gatherer cultures, interestingly, don't teach. They teach in a very broad sense of teaching, the same way that you and I might teach if we were just having conversation. And they also will answer questions, and the adults are also very helpful. I mean, part of the theory, part of the whole idea of hunter-gatherer culture is it's a culture of sharing. And so they share information, but they don't impose information. If a child asks for something, if a child wants to, in fact, one anthropologist described a scene where there was a man who was pounding some metal over a fire to shape something, and a little toddler came in and wanted to sit on his lap and play a role in pounding it and was getting in his way. And she described, instead of just shooing the child away, he let the child be as close as he could possibly be without serious danger. And he just slowed down. He just stopped tapping for a while. He recognized that this child was very interested in what he was doing. He allowed the child to be, even though the child was interfering with his work, he allowed the child to be there because he recognized this is how children learn. Children want to be engaged to the degree that they can possibly be engaged in what the adults are doing, and that's how they learn to, that's one way in which they learn to do those things. They get an idea what these things are like. All right, so at this point, depending on the audience that I'm speaking to, many people are thinking, well, you know, that's all fine and good for hunter-gatherers. But we, of course, are not hunter-gatherers. Too bad we're not. If we were hunter-gatherers, then raising our children would be easy. We just let them go out and play. But we're not hunter-gatherers. Very different culture from a hunter-gatherer culture. We live in a culture, for example, where reading and writing and arithmetic are important to the culture. Hunter-gatherer cultures don't have these things. They don't have written language. So there's no reading and writing. They don't even have numbers, believe it or not. Some of them don't even have number words beyond 1, 2, and many. Their culture doesn't really depend upon numbers. The way they do things, they just measure things kind of qualitatively. They don't worry about counting things. They don't know anybody's IQ, for example. So they don't measure things. And so here's this world of numbers, and I've been told by many of my colleagues in psychology and even evolutionary psychology, well, these are things entirely new that we didn't evolve with, reading, writing, and numbers, and arithmetic, and calculation. These are things that, of course, we have to teach, because nobody's going to learn these naturally. These were not part of our evolutionary history. And then there's another difference, of course, which is this. Although it is true, as I said, that hunter-gatherers have to learn as much as we do to be successful in their culture, in our culture, there's many more different pathways that one could take. You don't just have a choice of hunting or gathering or a few of the other kinds of skills that are important, and you don't necessarily have the opportunity to see all of what adults do around you. There are adults doing all sorts of different things, and there's no way that you can sit on the lap of all of them and observe what different all the adults in our culture are doing. So it's a powerful argument that we can't just automatically extract from hunter-gatherer culture and think that is going to work in our culture. In fact, I probably would have been prone to just think of these kinds of studies that I described as interesting, having to do with hunter-gatherer cultures, but irrelevant to the questions of education in our culture, were it not for the fact that even before I ever looked into hunter-gatherer cultures, I had already been observing and conducting some studies at the Sudbury Valley School, the school that Eunice referred to in her talk, and the school that her school in Jerusalem is modeled after. So let me tell you a little bit about that school. Fortunately, I don't have to spend too much time on it because Eunice gave such a wonderful presentation of the spirit of such a school. But let me just give you a few specifics about the Sudbury Valley School. First of all, it was founded in 1968. So this is not an experiment. This is a school that's been going on for almost half a century, 48 years to be exact. It's got hundreds and hundreds of graduates who are out there in the real world. So this is not some new idea that's just being tested. This is something that's been around for half a century. Secondly, this school is open. It enrolls children. Anybody who applies basically is accepted, and they have to have a visiting week that shows that they can be responsible, that they're not going to break rules, they're not going to do something awful at the school. But beyond that, basically any kid who applies and whose parents agree to send them there is accepted. There's no academic testing, there's no selectivity. There is a tuition charge. The tuition is now about $8,000 a year, and that may sound like a lot, but compared to other private schools, it's very, very little in the United States, and it's about half as much as the per pupil cost of the local public schools. So this is not expensive education. If for some magical reason the whole government were to go to this kind of school, taxpayers would save a lot of money. This is a cheaper school to run, not a more expensive school to run. So that's some basics about the school. The school is on a beautiful grounds, about 10 acres of land. There's a pond there. It's adjacent to a forested state park. They were very lucky to get this land. The school building is an old Victorian-style farmhouse, and there's a remodeled barn. It doesn't look at all like a school. It looks more like a big house with living room furniture, and there's a kitchen, and there's books on the bookcases and so on and so forth. You don't feel like you're walking into a school if you walk into this place. The school is governed democratically in the way that you just described. All the rules are made at the school meeting. The staff members, including Danny Greenberg and his wife, and including another staff member who were among the founders of the school and who are still there 48 years later, they are only on a one-year contract. Every staff member is just on a one-year contract, which has to be renewed every single year, and part of the renewal is a vote among the school meeting people, which is the students and the staff. And if you don't get that vote, you don't become a staff member the next year. So here's a school where the children can fire the staff, right? The children can fire the staff. One thing that ensures is that staff members there are people who children like and admire. If you are not liked and admired by children, which would probably mean that you're a person who doesn't particularly like children or doesn't know how to get along with them very well, you're not going to remain a staff member there. Sometimes people think, well, wouldn't it be awfully easy to just buy votes? You know, we could just give candy to the 4-year-olds and they'll vote for us. And turns out that they're more sophisticated than that. They can really recognize, sometimes they've even voted against staff members who are in some sense quite popular and liked by the kids, but they recognize the argument would basically be so-and-so is a nice person, but he or she is really just acting like a student here. And why should this person be paid to be here if he or she is just acting like a student? This person doesn't seem to be taking on the adult-like responsibilities of the school. So the kids are more sophisticated than some people might give them credit for in terms of how. Then they're also, of course, listening to the arguments of the older people. I don't want to mislead you. The older people have more influence at the school meeting than the younger people, for the same reason that the elders and wiser people among hunter-gatherers have more influence around the campfire than do the younger or more foolish people, right? And so there is something that can be gained by years. Not everybody gains much by years. Some people just remain foolish their whole life. And some people are wise from the beginning. I don't know what accounts for those kinds of things, but I think there is some relationship. Over time, we do gain some experience and so on. So it's not surprising to me that the people who have the biggest influence at the school meeting are the staff members, and the next group of people who have big influence are the teenagers, the older students, and the younger students have relatively less influence, but of course, if they're there, they've got to be convinced. So you have to phrase your argument in such a way that even a young child can understand it. I wish that our United States Congress had to do that. There's something enlightening about that, putting your argument in terms that even a child can understand. There's hardly an argument on earth that can't be put in such terms. So I think that makes the debate and the whole process better at the school meeting. All the school rules are made that way. None of the rules have anything to do with learning. The educational philosophy is basically that of a hunter-gatherer culture. Children will learn. All we have to do is give them the free time and space and opportunity to learn and the conditions in which learning can occur. In hunter-gatherer cultures, those conditions occur naturally. They're just part and parcel of being a hunter-gatherer. That's not so true in our culture. And so in our culture, the school in some way provides, what I'm going to argue is for our times, the educational equivalent of a hunter-gatherer band. So the school, the rules are enforced by the Judicial Committee, as you described. I should say that the Sudbury Valley School currently has about 150 or 160 students and 8 staff members. This is not a school that requires a whole lot of staff members per student. That's actually would be for a private school, that would be regarded as a poor ratio of staff to students. But because there's very little that the staff have to do in terms of discipline. They're not, they don't have to be prison guards. There's relatively little that the staff are doing in terms of any kind of formal teaching. The kids are learning much more from one another than they are from adults. Because of all of that, you don't need to have a lot of staff members. You do need to have some. You need this adult presence in the school to round out the community. So then the question, When I first got involved with the school, it was because my son had rebelled in public school to such a point that we were desperate. What were we going to do? We even sent him to this radically alternative school, for God's sake. So what were we going to do, And I was a university professor, and I had thought about such schools. In fact, my mother, years ago, had been involved in some educational experiments and had told me about Summerhill and A.S. Neal and so on and so forth. But I always thought my mother was kind of a hippie and crazy, and I never, I was the square one in the family, the scientist. I was not a romantic idealist. I needed data and evidence, unlike her. So I needed some evidence that he wasn't going to ruin his life by going to this school. So I would ask about graduates of the school. I could see he was happy. I could see the other kids were happy. No, for Scott's mother, that was enough. She saw he was happy. And I'm getting teary. But her view was that if he's happy, he's going to be okay. But I'm the man here, right? So I got to know that he's going to make a living. He's going to be able to go off and support himself. Happiness isn't all there is in the world. So I needed to be assured, in some sense, that you could go through this school and come out the other end as an educated person, in the sense that you could go on to whatever career you wanted to go on. You could go on to higher education if you wanted to do that. This is stretching things. You're going through a place where you're not being given any tests. You're not taking any of the standard courses. I mean, we have a view in the United States, and you probably have it here too, that if you miss any of this, if you miss a few days or weeks of public school, you're going to be behind, right? You're going to fall behind, and maybe you'll never catch up. Well, here's kids missing the whole damn thing. Really, truly, never taking a course, never taking a test. Can they go on to college? It boggles the mind. Well, I discovered that those who want to go on to college, including those that in my initial study of the graduates had done all of their education at this school, had never read a textbook as far as I could tell, had never taken a test, except when they took what in the United States is called the SAT test that you need to take to get into a competitive school. Somehow they prepared for that, did okay on that, and got into the school that they wanted to go to. So here, one of the findings, so I did this study of graduates to assure myself that I wasn't a negligent parent to send my child to this odd school. So I did this study, and it absolutely changed my orientation about education. These young people were going on in all walks of life. I couldn't see any major career area that we value in our culture that there weren't Sudbury Valley graduates had gone on to it. Those who wanted to go on to university were able to do so and to do well at university. Those who didn't want to go to university had good reasons for thinking they didn't need university. After all, they certainly didn't need it to learn. They had been learning all their lives without the structure of anything like a university. But these were people who didn't really kind of need the certification of a degree at a university. They had chosen careers that don't require that. Maybe they were founding their own business, or they were going into some kind of artistic endeavor or something. Turns out there are many careers even today in the United States that don't really require a college degree as a certificate to go on to it. But those who are going on to become doctors or lawyers or certain other kinds of professionals that more or less require a college degree, four-year college degree, in order to go on into the professional school for that, we're figuring out how to get in and to do well there. One of the things that I discovered in this initial study of the graduates of the school was that many of them develop a real passion for something while they are young, in their play. And many of those who develop a passion find a way to make a living doing, as an adult, the very thing that they loved when they were playing. So let me just give you a few examples of that from among the students in this initial study. This study was done many years ago, by the way, but there have been a couple of studies of graduates done since by the school itself with similar kinds of findings. So one of the graduates in this sample that I studied was somebody who at the time of the study was a machinist, but he was more than a machinist, he was an inventor. He was the kind of person, if you needed a machine that would do something that nobody else had built a machine that could do, he would figure out a way to do it. He was kind of regarded as kind of a genius, very successful. He was a kid who, when he was about 8 or 9 years old at the school, was playing in constructive play. He would make whole villages or little factories out of plasticine, and everything had to be to scale. He was sort of the ringleader of a group of boys who were all into this, and they would spend days building a whole village of plasticine. And then, of course, being boys, they would have a war and tear the whole thing apart. And then they would build it up again over more days. And when he got a little bit older, he would get a staff member to take him to the dump, and they'd bring back parts of bicycles, and he would create bicycles and sell them for a few bucks from these bicycle parts. And he graduated from that to taking cars apart, and he would spend time off campus hanging around a local garage and learning from the mechanics there, who were quite delighted to have a young person there who seemed to be interested in what they were doing and learning what they were doing. And so by the time he graduated, he was well on his way to what for him was the ideal job. There was another graduate, a young woman, who at the time of the study was captain of a cruise ship. She's a girl who, as a girl, had been fascinated by the pond, played with little boats on the pond, got interested in navigation, took some time off from campus. The school had a very open campus policy to spend time out on Cape Cod, apprenticing herself to a ship captain there. And by the time she graduated, she was well on her way to what for her was her dream job. There was another graduate in that study who was apparently a well-known fashion designer in the high fashion dress industry. She's a person who is a little girl, like many little girls like to play with dolls, and she got into making clothes for her dolls, and then she kind of went from that to making clothes for herself and her friends, and loved to invent new kinds of clothes and make patterns for them. At some point, she apprenticed herself to a pattern maker and was well, by the time she graduated, on her way to her dream job. Now, just so that you know, there are some people who go on into what we would call academic careers. There was one of the graduates who was, at the time of the study, was a graduate student in mathematics. He's a person who's now a professor of mathematics. And in our study of the graduates, I asked him how he got interested in mathematics, and he told this story about how he became really drawn at a very young age into science fiction. And he was fascinated. He would read one science fiction story after another, and he became kind of a connoisseur of science fiction. And he developed the idea that a really good science fiction is a story in which everything is basically follows the rules of the real world, except there's one thing that's different. There's one thing that's changed. And then you have to follow through logically. If you change this thing, what else has to change? What are the consequences of that? And he claimed that at some point he discovered that's what mathematics was all about. You develop this idea, if this is true, then what else has to be true? If we accept this axiom. So he's a person who at a relatively young age and largely self-taught became really quite good at mathematics and went on. He was also into music, and it's the question whether he was going to go into music, piano, or mathematics. He ultimately chose mathematics. There was another who was still in his early to mid-20s at the time of the study, and he was probably the person making the most money at that time among the graduates. He had founded a software company. He had been a student at a time, this was at a time when home computers were just coming into vogue. The school, when he came to the school at age 13, he had been failing in the local public school. He claimed he had flunked out. I don't know if you can actually flunk out of public school, but surely he was doing very badly and maybe was kind of kicked out. So he came to Sudbury Valley at age 13, and somehow he became fascinated by computers. And at that point, there was no computers in the school. the school has these organizations that they call corporations. And so there's a cooking corporation which lobbies for cooking equipment in the school at the school meeting and figures out how to certify who gets to use the potentially dangerous equipment in the kitchen. How do you train little kids so that you can certify them to use it and so on? Well, he developed what he called, and a few other people who joined him called the Computer Corporation. And he called local computer manufacturers in the Boston area who were just starting up in that area. And he called them and said, I'm the head of the Computer Corporation at the Sudbury Valley School, and we would be very interested in learning how to use your model computer, and would you donate one? I don't know if any of them knew they were talking to a 13-year-old kid. But he got donations from a number of different computer companies. He figured out how to use the computers, and that's how computers got started at Sudbury Valley. Pretty soon other kids knew how to do them, sometime maybe long after the staff learned how to do them. But the initiative came from him. By the time he graduated, he was well on his way to founding a software company, and he told us proudly that one of his clients was the school district that had flunked him out. So those are some of the stories. Not all of the stories, not all of the cases involve such a direct relationship between play as youngsters and what they're doing as adults, but a remarkably large number do. And almost all of them, when you trace what they were doing as kids to what they're doing as adults, you can see a lot of overlap. You can see how the kinds of skills that they were working at, that they were developing, played into what they were now successfully and in many ways playfully doing as adults now for a living. Okay, so now I don't want to spend too much more time because I want to leave time for questions and discussion. But if you've got that handout in front of you, we are now, I'm not going to do all of the rest of the handout, but we are now at point D on this handout, the optimal context for self-education, how Sudbury Valley School is like a hunter-gatherer band. So I suggested that in our culture, I don't think you can just turn kids loose and expect that they're going to become educated. They may or may not, and it depends upon where this being loose is. You can't learn things that aren't part of the world around you. You can't learn to read, for example, if nobody in your neighborhood reads. You can't learn the skills. Groos's argument was that children learn what they see around them. So if children are going to learn the skills that are important in our culture, although we have to recognize, we have to be humble about our predictions of what is important in our culture. As Judith pointed out, we don't really know what's going to be important in our culture tomorrow for our children today. But if we expect them to learn the things that at least we immediately think of are generally important, reading, writing, use of numbers, things like that, then they need to grow up in a world where those things are at least present. So, and they also, my argument is, they need to grow up in a world that has certain other characteristics to it. So I've listed here under D 6 different characteristics of the learning environment that exists at the Sudbury Valley School that also exists in a hunter-gatherer band. And as I go through these 6 points, I want you to attend to the fact that none of these things exist in our standard schools, none of them. It's as if we take away in our standard schools all of the conditions that children need to educate themselves. We do that quite deliberately because we don't want them to educate themselves. We want to educate them because we think we know how better. So our schools are deliberately set up in such a way as to deprive children of all of the conditions that they need to educate themselves so that we, in a far less effective way, can educate them. So let me tell you what these conditions are. The first condition is the social expectation and reality that education is children's responsibility. Now, I'm sure that many teachers in public schools say your education is your responsibility, but it's pretty clear that they don't mean it. because they are taking so much responsibility. They're telling you what to learn, they're telling you how to learn it, they're testing you continuously, they're deciding whether you've learned it or not learned it. So those words, your education is your responsibility, are empty words. And every child learns that what their responsibility to do at school is not to educate themselves and figure out even what that means. Their responsibility is to do what they're told to do. That's really what teachers mean when they say your education is your responsibility. It's your responsibility to do exactly what I tell you to do. And that way you will become educated. Well, if you believe that, and some children begin to believe it, then you give up educating yourself. You say, my job is just to do what I'm told to do. And of course, the truth of the matter is, you don't really become very well educated that way. So that's the first step. You have to really set the conditions such that you mean it, that children are responsible for their own education. You can't go halfway. You can't then say, oh, I'm worried that Johnny is now 9 years old and can't read, so I better start making sure that I'm giving him little books that he'll be interested in so he'll read, and so on and so forth. You start doing that, and you take away the idea that it's little Johnny's responsibility to decide when and if he wants to learn how to read. So that's the first condition. In the hunter-gatherer band, adults are not telling children what to do. They're not evaluating. They're not comparing. They're not saying, you know, so-and-so is a little bit behind in tracking game. What do we have to do to bring him up? That's not going on in hunter-gatherer groups. It's not going on at Sudbury Valley School. So-and-so is a little bit behind in learning how to read. What can we do to bring him up? Second characteristic, unlimited freedom to play, explore, and pursue your own interests. Unlimited freedom. I think that Eudice's talk showed why so much freedom is important. That kid, you need time to get bored. You need time to admit you're bored. You need time to overcome boredom. You need time to figure out what are the questions you want to address. What are the questions that are important to you? You need time to try out a lot of different things. And if you do get passionate about something, you need time to pursue that passion. You can't have it be interrupted every hour by a bell that tells you now it's time to move on. I mean, that kid working that plasticine table, he would arrive as early in the morning as he could and stay as late as he could, and he would fight to stay overnight if he was allowed to work on what he was doing because he was passionately doing it. It was would be cruel to interrupt him because he was so involved in doing what he was doing. So you need time and freedom to explore and pursue your own interests. Third characteristic, you need opportunity to play with the tools of the culture. Now, I use the term play with the tools of the culture, which really means do your own thing with the tools. Turn the tools upside down. Do creative things with them. Don't just do what a teacher in school might tell you to do in some stepwise way. That's, first of all, it's boring, and secondly, it's not how you really learn to use a tool. Those hunter-gatherer kids, they're playing with machetes and fire and bows and arrows. They're really playing with them. They're working out all the possibilities of what they can do with that. What is the tool, the main tool of our culture today? It is without question the computer. Every child coming into our culture today, just as every child coming into a hunter-gatherer culture sees that knives and fire and bows and arrows and digging sticks, that's their tools because everybody's got to know how to use them. Every child coming into our culture cannot help but look around and say the one tool that if there's one tool I have to know, it's the computer. Everybody uses computers. No matter what career I go into, I'm going to have to be good at computers. And then a lot of us blame our kids for playing with computers. You know, to play with a computer, to tell a 2-year-old you can't play with a computer would be like a hunter-gatherer culture adult saying you can't play with a bow and arrow or you can't play with a machete. It would be depriving the child of the opportunity to develop the skill that that child knows in his gut and his bones is the most important skill that I've got to develop in this culture that I am growing up in. Let's remember, our children are growing up today. They're not growing up when you and I grew up. They're not growing up in the 1950s when I grew up. So it would be really wrong of me to believe that my children ought to be playing, just because I loved to play with certain things when I was a kid, it would be really wrong for me to believe today that my children ought to be playing with the same things I was playing with, and it must be harmful to them to play with this stuff that didn't even exist when I was a child. We've got to get over that as adults. So we have to let them play with the tools. Of course, it's not just computers. Sudbury Valley has cooking equipment, there's sporting equipment, there's art equipment, there's woodworking shop, there are all kinds of tools that children become drawn to. But the one universal tool that essentially everybody gets drawn to, not because anybody tells them they have to, is the computer. So a fourth characteristic is access to a variety of caring adults who are helpers, not judges. Now, in a typical school classroom, there's only one adult there who may or may not be a role model for every child in the class. Rarely would be a role model for every child in the class. Very often would not be a real role model for anybody, except maybe that particular person who wants to become a teacher. Because you're not really seeing that person as a real person in their whole life. You're seeing them in the role of teacher. So you're not really being exposed to adults of the culture when you're being exposed just to a teacher in a classroom. But at Sudbury schools, even the schools that are much smaller, and maybe they could get by with just one or two adults, they think it's important to have a number of adults because it's good to have a variety of different personalities of adulthood present. It's good to have people with a variety of different skills. So children at Sudbury Valley know that if you need a lap to sit on or a shoulder to cry on, this would be the staff member you would go to. Everybody can figure that out really easily. That staff member would be the last one to go to if you want that. But maybe that staff member would be a good staff member to go to if you want to test out a political idea you've been thinking about or a new scientific hypothesis. Different staff members have different interests, different skills, and kids learn which ones have which skills, and the fact that they can go to any of them is really, really important. In a hunter-gatherer culture, the parents are not, of course there's a special relationship in a sense between kids and their parents, but the kids learn at least as much from the other adults in the band as they do from their own parents, if not more. They're very interested in what all the adults do, what they're like, and learning what their skills are. And the fact that they're not judges. The very worst person to learn from is somebody who's also judging you. Because when you know that you are being judged, you automatically and quite appropriately go into impression management mode. You don't want to admit to the person who's judging you that you're ignorant about this. You don't want to admit your lack of skill because this is the person who decides whether you pass or fail. Your job is to show how much you know and to veer away from the things that you don't know when you are in the presence of a teacher who's evaluating you. So it's very important to the staff at the Sudbury schools that they do not be seen and they are not evaluators of the children. Just as hunter-gatherer people don't test or evaluate or talk about who's ahead and who's behind, neither do the staff members at Sudbury Valley. It's a little harder for staff members at Sudbury schools to learn this. This is one of the things they have to learn because it's so automatic in our culture to judge and evaluate children that you almost have to learn not to do it. You have to unlearn these kinds of habits that the culture ingrains in us. Fifth characteristic, and this is the one that I have spent the most time studying myself, and is in some sense the key to learning at a Sudbury Model School, and that's free age mixing among children and adolescents. At Sudbury schools, there's no segregation of children by age. There are children age 4 on through the late teenage years, basically through what would be high school age elsewhere. And sometimes there's even older people, sometimes occasionally somebody in their 20s who for one reason or another decides to be a student at the school. So there's this whole age range. And one of my graduate students did his doctoral dissertation on age mixing at the school. He spent many hundreds of hours at the school making observations of age-mixed play. And he and I together analyzed these observations and wrote a couple of academic articles about them. But the basic finding is this: even though there's enough kids at this school that they could segregate by age if they wanted to, they could be playing just with kids within a year or 2 or 3 of their own age, but they don't. They play across wide age spans. Most of their interactions are across an age span of several years. By one of our studies, we determined that a full quarter of their interactions were across an age span of 4 years or more. That's a significant amount. That's where you can really see the difference in age. And in this study, my graduate student was particularly interested in children, in adolescents, kids who had passed puberty, who were playing with kids who had not reached yet puberty. So the age difference is obvious in their physical development. And what we observed in this is, first of all, there's a lot of such play. It's joyful play. And secondly, that such play always involves teaching. Essentially always involves teaching. It's not teaching that you would necessarily recognize as teaching unless you broaden your definition of teaching. But whatever they're doing, the older child, being more mature, being generally more skilled at the task, is scaffolding the younger child up to a higher level of activity than they would be able to do themselves. So, for example, I mean, just to give you a very simple example by way of illustration, if you had a school of all 4-year-olds, a simple game of toss and catch, tossing a ball back and forth and catching it, the kind of simplest sort of sporting activity you could have, would be impossible. And the reason is because no 4-year-old can throw the ball straight enough for the other 4-year-old to catch it, and no 4-year-old can catch the wild throw of the other 4-year-old. So the game quickly falls apart. It's just no fun. But add an 8-year-old to the mix. And the 8-year-old and the 4-year-old, they can have a fun game of catch in which both of them are having fun because the 8-year-old can toss the ball gently into the hands of the 4-year-old so that he actually can catch it some of the time. And the 8-year-old can leap and jump and run and catch the wild throw of the 4-year-old, and they're both having fun. Now that's simply a kind of metaphor for all kinds of learning that's going on at the school. In a sense, that's how many children learn to read. There's children who can't read who are playing a game with children who can read. And the children who can read are scaffolding the younger. They're not deliberately teaching them to read, but they're pointing out the words. They're saying, look, this word on the screen, this means this. Remember it. I don't want to have to tell it to you again. So they are pointing out words. They're reading. Older kids are often reading to younger kids. Older kids like to read to younger kids. So there's scaffolding going on in the wide ranges of activity. So that shows what the younger kids are learning from the older kids. The older kids are learning something that's at least as important from their interactions with the younger kids. They are learning how to be caretakers. They're learning how to be nurturing. They're learning how to explain things. You know, we've seen, for example, games of chess between an older, really almost a chess master, and a younger kid who is just kind of a novice at the game. And what happens is that not only is the older kid teaching the younger kid how to play chess, but the older kid is in some sense becoming a better chess player himself because the older kid says, no, don't move the pawn here, move the pawn here. And the younger kid says, why? Well, the older kid has never really thought that through. He knows that that's the better move. He's learned that's the better move. He's got a great chess memory. He's studied many games, but he's never really answered the question, why? And so this leads him to now think about it at a deeper level. And he doesn't necessarily know the answer, but it gets him thinking about it. Many of us who've been teachers know that you really learn something when you have to teach it, because to explain it to somebody else, you have to put into words what you may have only vaguely had in your head before. And once you put it into words, and especially if the person you're teaching questions you about it, you might recognize, wait a minute, I've got to think more deeply about this. Certainly that's the experience I had as a college professor and I think that these kids, older kids, are having that experience all the time as they are explaining things to younger kids. Moreover, there is a lot of evidence that the simple presence of younger kids has a pacifying effect upon teenagers. There's actually, I've written an article on this. There's actually, not just from studies of Sudbury Valley School, but studies of age mixing in general show that especially teenage boys are simply nicer people when there's young kids around than when there are not young kids around. There was a study in Kenya, for example, many years ago, that showed that those boys who by default have to do some babysitting at home because they don't have an older sister who can do the babysitting. They become nicer people, not just to little kids, but even to their peers. They're known to their friends as kinder and gentler than those kids who don't have babysitting responsibility. So I think that the simple presence of the 4- and 5-year-olds at the school helps to pacify. And you can even hear older kids talking about, oh, you know, don't use that language. There's a so-and-so is here. So they are aware of trying to be a good role model to the younger kids. That's part of it. Moreover, it's very hard in our culture, and there are some kids who come to the school as new students this way, who are kind of down on life. They're cynical, they're burned out, they're depressed. It's kind of hard to remain that way very long when you've got 4-year-olds running around happily, wanting you to give them a piggyback ride, and so on and so forth. The 4-year-olds, just their spirit, their creativity. Just as the younger kids are learning more sophisticated activities from the older kids are retaining their creativity and their zest for life in ways that they might not so much if there weren't younger kids there. One of the worst things we do in our culture is to segregate children by age, and that's an entirely new thing. Throughout the history of the human world, children always played in age-mixed groups. The drive to play came about under conditions in hunter-gatherer cultures where play was always age-mixed. Play among children all the same age is artificial. It's an artifact of modern times. Recess, where children are all the same age. There's a lot of bullying that goes on. One thing we know about age-mixed play is it tends to promote bullying. Of same-age play is that it tends to promote bullying. Age mixing tends to greatly reduce bullying because the older kids kind of look out for the younger kids. And you see that all the time at Sudbury Valley School. My graduate student who spent so much time there, actually the first thing he said to me, compared to any other setting where he'd observed lots of children, said, "I'm just amazed that there's no bullying here." And I believe it's partly because of the democratic process, the school meeting, the way you can bring somebody up if they are infringing on your rights and so on and so forth. But I think that equally important, if not more so, is the fact that it's age-based, that the older kids are looking out for the younger kids, and the older kids are, in some sense, modeling for the younger kids, modeling a gentler and kinder way of behaving. So I'm going to, even though I had more that I could talk about on this list, I would rather stop at this point and leave at least some time for questions and discussion. And so I thank you all so much for being present. I thank you for your kind attention. And I thank you mostly for the fact that you are here. The fact that you found it worthwhile to come to this meeting and hear you just talk and me talk means that you are concerned about children, that you're concerned about the new generation, that you are probably motivated to try to do something to make the world better for our children than it currently is. And so I applaud you for having that interest. Thank you very much.